There's a question most people never ask about the behaviors that leave you feeling controlled in a conversation. Why does someone do this? Not what did they do, but what's happening underneath that makes this their automatic response. You've probably sat there after a conversation, replaying it, wondering where you went wrong when really, the other person had just quietly steered the whole thing somewhere else. Today isn't a checklist of tactics. It's a look at the psychological wiring underneath, so you can see why these patterns work on you as well as they do. Start with the foundation. Most behaviors that leave you feeling disoriented in a conversation trace back to one specific fear: losing control of their own emotional state. According to attachment theory, people who grew up in environments where their emotional needs weren't reliably met often develop defense strategies to avoid feeling hurt or abandoned again. The problem is, those same strategies, carried into adulthood, show up as behaviors that make the people around them feel manipulated, whether or not that was ever the intention. Take topic switching. In a meeting, you ask a coworker why their report was late. Instead of answering directly, they say, "Yeah, it's late, but honestly, everyone keeps dumping extra work on me, and nobody notices the pressure I'm under." Instantly, the conversation shifts from their accountability to their unfair treatment. This isn't always a calculated move. For a lot of people, it's a defense reflex built in childhood, back when admitting fault directly used to invite harsh criticism. The brain learned that redirecting felt safer than facing it head-on. The same logic applies to well-timed vulnerability. Someone gets asked a hard question and suddenly brings up something painful from their past, voice softening, eyes drifting. You assume it's coincidence, or worse, you blame yourself for hurting them further. But from a defense mechanism lens, this can be a learned pattern for de-escalating conflict, not always a conscious strategy. The issue is, intentional or not, the effect on you is identical. You stop pushing, and the conversation ends exactly where they needed it to. In families, this pattern often shows up even more clearly. A parent might open with an extreme demand, grounding a kid for a month, then compromise down to a week. The kid feels relieved, even grateful, even though the underlying restriction never really changed. This is a natural anchoring effect. Compared to the extreme first option, the second one automatically feels reasonable, even when it isn't. What's worth noting is that the person making the original demand often isn't consciously using a strategy at all. They've simply learned through experience that this approach gets less pushback. There's a quieter mechanism too, twisting your words. You say, "I need some space," and they hear, "I'm being abandoned again." On the surface, it looks like deliberate distortion meant to put you on the defensive. But for people with a deep-rooted fear of abandonment from earlier relationships, their brain genuinely interprets any signal of distance as a threat, even when none was intended. The result is you're stuck in an endless loop of clarifying yourself, not because they're trying to trap you, but because their emotional filter is misfiring. Then there's repetition, which is one of the more well-documented effects in psychology. The human brain tends to believe things it hears often, regardless of accuracy, simply because familiarity feels like safety. When someone repeatedly tells you that you're too sensitive or overreacting, over time, it's not because their argument holds up. It's because repetition wears down your ability to push back. This is exactly why personal boundaries, eroded a little at a time, often go unnoticed until they've nearly disappeared. Pulling a third party into the mix is another familiar move, especially at work or in multi-generational families. Everyone in the office thinks so. Even grandma said you've changed. This creates a manufactured sense of consensus that makes you feel like the outlier, whether or not everyone or grandma actually said any of it, or meant it that way. Psychologically, this is often a form of external validation seeking. common in people who don't fully trust their own argument, so they borrow other people's voices to reinforce it. And finally, maybe the most uncomfortable one, silence after conflict. Not the kind of silence that means someone's calming down, but a total emotional blank. No response, no expression, nothing. For the person on the receiving end, that silence creates an information vacuum, and the human brain doesn't tolerate ambiguity well. It fills the gap with fear, fear that you did something wrong. So you start apologizing, not because you were actually at fault, but because uncertainty feels worse than taking the blame. One thing worth saying clearly: understanding the mechanism behind these behaviors isn't an excuse for them, and it doesn't mean everyone who does this has some underlying condition. These are learned response patterns that can show up in anyone under enough stress, and they can also change if someone recognizes them and is willing to work on it. If you find yourself consistently on the receiving end of these patterns, and it's genuinely affecting your mental well-being, talking to a licensed mental health professional is always worth considering. What you can do starting right now is much simpler. Next time a conversation suddenly changes direction, or you catch yourself explaining something you never even said, pause for 1 second and ask yourself, is this conversation going where you need it to, or where they need it to? That single question can be enough to hand some of the control back to you. Have you noticed any of these patterns yourself, at work, at home, or in a relationship? Drop it in the comments. Your story might help someone else recognize what they're going through. And if you want more breakdowns like this, subscribe so you don't miss the next one.